Hello and welcome to this London Art Week talk. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Emanuela Tarizzo and I'm Gallery Director at Tomasso Brothers Fine Art. We are a gallery specializing in European master paintings and sculpture, and we are members of London Art Week, the association that's hosting today's talk. With me today are Dr. Silvia Davoli and Elyse Nelson. Silvia is curator at Strawberry Hill House in London. She's also research associate at the University of Oxford and associate editor at the Journal of the History of Collections. Silvia is an expert in the collection of Horace Walpole, and in 2018 she co-curated the wonderful exhibition Lost Treasures of Strawberry Hill. And we will hear a lot more about Horace Walpole and his collection today. Elyse is assistant curator in the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where she looks after the sculpture and cameos from the 18th and 19th century in the collection. She previously co-curated exhibitions on Rodin at the Met in 2017 and the exhibition Lifelike. She's currently working on a redisplay of the European paintings galleries at the museum to include sculpture, and on an exhibition on capo and sculpture in the Age of Abolition. So thank you very much to our two speakers for joining us today. And I think before we start and before we go into the details of Andema and her work, I'll just briefly give you an outline of her life, because maybe not many of you might be familiar with it. Anne Seymour Damer was born in 1748, and she was the daughter of Field Marshal Henry Seymour Conway and his wife, Lady Caroline Campbell, and she was the daughter of the fourth Duke of Argyll. So she was born very much into a prominent Whig family, and her parents had very important connections within the literary world of her period, which would definitely influence the rest of her life. Her father was a cousin of Horace Walpole, and the two were very close, and Walpole was actually Anne's guardian when her parents were traveling extensively as she was growing up. So Anne married in 1767. She married the Honourable John Damer, the eldest son of Lord Milton. And he was actually the heir to a rather considerable fortune, but he was also a heavy gambler, which meant that he squandered most of this fortune and actually sadly killed himself in 1776. So she was widowed only at the age of 29, but she never remarried. And throughout her life, Anne Damer really traveled quite extensively throughout the continent, especially to Italy and France. And she met some very prominent figures of her time. In Paris, she met Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife. And on many occasions, she went to Italy, where in Florence, she stayed with the British envoy, Sir Horace Mann, and in Naples, she stayed with the British ambassador, Sir William Hamilton, and his wife, Emma Hamilton. And for instance, when in 1799, when Lord Nelson came to Naples, he sat for Damer because they were staying in the same house. They were both guests of the Hamiltons. And here I have a couple of slides that I wanted to show you before we really start. In this first one, you see a self-portrait that she made of herself when she was 30, and she presented it to the Uffizi galleries in Florence. And next to it is an engraving after a portrait of her by Richard Cosway, who was actually a friend. And you can really see, I hope these give you a sense of Damer and how she saw herself, and how much she identified with her work as a sculptor. And here there's a brief outline of some of her works. As I mentioned earlier, there's the portrait of Lord Nelson, there's Joseph Banks, the prominent botanist, Elizabeth Farren, Mrs. Freeman, a famous actress at the time, Caroline, Princess of Wales, future queen, and Prince Henry Lubomirski, if I pronounce this correctly, who was considered to be the most beautiful child of the time. And he was painted several times by Angelica Kaufman and sculpted by Canova. But so hopefully now you have an outline of Anne Damer's life and of her work. But what I wanted to begin with actually is, Silvia, can you tell us a bit more about Anne Damer's relationship with Horace Walpole, her guardian, and also how Walpole was instrumental in and supported her in her career as a sculptor?
So, as you mentioned before, Horace Walpole was Anne Damer's godfather, and really Walpole was very much attached to his cousin, Seymour Conway. They practically grew up together, and they also traveled to Italy together, so they share many experience, and we have a fair amount of letters they exchange. And in this painting that Walpole commissioned in the 1750s to the painter John Giles Eckert, we can see a nice portrait. This portrait was part of a set of portraits Walpole commissioned with members of his family and friends represented, and was done after Watteau. And the sitters are Harry Seymour Conway, his wife, and little Anne Damer, by then aged between 3 and 5 years old. And in fact, it's funny to think that actually Anne Damer spent, when she was only 3 years old, she spent the summer at Strawberry Hill House together with Walpole while her parents were abroad. And this is, I mean, it's really exceptional if we think that later on, Walpole wouldn't allow any children in the house. He didn't want children to touch his precious collection, of course, very delicate collection. And this is why I think Anne Damer truly, I mean, and she enjoyed her time at Strawberry Hill. And I think she saw all the different phases of Strawberry Hill, because as we know, Strawberry Hill was built in different phases. And also the collection was formed during a long time. And Anne Damer was there. This is why when Walpole died in 1797, he left a lifelong interest in Strawberry Hill to Anne Damer. And this was a huge responsibility. Strawberry Hill, the collection and the garden were, after all, Walpole's masterpiece. So it was a huge responsibility for Anne Damer. And she fulfilled her role quite carefully. And she was actually, she moved in 1798, and she lived at Strawberry Hill until 1810. And she, during this period, she was very careful in annotating every single change in the collection and in the display of the collection inside the house. And also she set up a studio in the printing house at Strawberry Hill. And also she kept showing around the house to the occasional visitors. Walpole has been, I think, a crucial, a fundamental figure behind Anne Damer career as a sculptress. Why? Because it's thanks to Walpole that nowadays Anne Damer is not a mere name in the history of British art. In fact, when she died, Anne Damer asked to have all letters, documents, book, and drawings, etc., destroyed. This is why Walpole's information, letters in anecdotes of painting, etc., constitute really a precious source for us in relation to Anne Damer. It's thanks to Walpole that we know something about the apprenticeship of Anne Damer. She attended classes with Ceracchi, the Italian sculptor who actually moved to London for a short period with John Bacon. It's thanks to Walpole that we have the first attempt of a raisonné of a work, and it's always thanks to Walpole that we have. I mean, it's Walpole who actually tried first to introduce our work in a global, in a more general discourse of, I mean, art historical discourse.
So how did he do that?
And he did it through I mean, in Anecdotes of Painting, there is mention of her work, but I think that the first thing he did was actually to connect her work to the tradition. So he did so for the bust, of course, but also for the animals. So Walpole was able to connect Andema's production of animal sculpture to the classical tradition, and he mentioned in his writing the Barberini goat or the Toscan boar, as well as the Jennings dog, that at the time were prominent Roman classical sculpture known by the public. At the same time, he was also able to, during a career, to give a kind of practical support as well. It's now almost certain that it was thanks to Walpole that Andema started and was put in touch with Ceracchi. And also, for instance, this is a very practical example, but quite interesting. When she was commissioned to sculpt the two gigantic keystone mask for the LA Bridge, was one of the first public commission Dema received. One of the criticism Andema most often was that was moved against Andema most often was that she wasn't actually she could produce models for sculptures, but that statues were in fact sculpted by other statuaries. That at the time was a rather common situation in other for men sculpture also, but in a case the criticism was quite strong. And Walpole, in one of his letters, for instance, explained, I mean, actually advised her not only to produce the model for the keystone, but also actually to sculpt them in order not to incur in criticism again. So we see that Walpole was there behind her in the formation of her career as a sculptress, but also present in the sense that he was trying to advise her on how to proceed and how to defend himself.
And was he, so we've talked about him, but was he alone in his admiration for Andema at the time, and were there others who supported her or didn't actually?
To evaluate Andema's appreciation among contemporaries is actually a very difficult task. Why? Because opinions were very contradictory. So no, Walpole wasn't alone. I mean, family's members, as well as intellectual scholars who actually were linked to the family, like for instance William Hamilton, the British envoy in Naples and the famous collector as well, and Hope, Thomas Hope, for instance, that was a famous collector of neoclassical statuary. They were quite admirative of her. On the other hand, we have example of artists, and so we are now talking about a more technical perspective, artists like Farrington or James Smith, who actually they didn't really trust her abilities as a sculptor. Whereas we have other famous artists like sculptors like Canova or Flaxman, who were quite supportive. And actually, for instance, Canova provided her with marbles, etc., etc. So yes, I mean, it's a complex geography. There are different opinions, and probably there were different reasons behind these opinions. What is important is, apart from this complexity, is to recognize that in the end, Dema exhibited many sculptures at the Royal Academy as an honorary visitor, but also she was able to actually to accomplish public commission and monuments and to compete. One example is the Nelson Memorial. So she was rather, I think, rather more than a gifted amateur.
Absolutely. Yes. And so here on screen, I've put her sculpture of King George III, which was this public commission for the Edinburgh Register House. And it's actually more than 2 meters high. And we know that Dama, when she was finishing it, decided to open a studio in London for people to see that she was actually, hammer and chisel in hand, she was carving the marble herself. And she must have been very much aware of these criticisms, because I've just selected this satirical print from 1789, which is very harsh. It's highly critical, and for her to just continue with her work, I think is admirable. You see her chiseling away from the back at the genitalia of a large Apollo. We know that she sculpted a large wooden Apollo for the theatre at Drury Lane, which actually was then lost because of a fire. But her contemporaries' opinions were definitely quite starkly opposed about her, but nonetheless, she continued with her work, which I think is admirable. And now I think going back to let's say to the beginning of her work as a sculptor, Elyse, can you tell us a bit about her training and how this compared to the experiences that her male contemporaries would have had?
Sure, thank you. Damer's credibility as a sculptor is often questioned. The depth of her knowledge of art, the depth of her abilities. And this is because of her lack of formal training. A male sculptor of her talent would have joined the academy, the Royal Academy for Technical Training, or spent, years in an accomplished sculptor's workshop as a pupil or apprentice or assistant, gaining all of that, technical skill. By comparison, Damer is said to have received, 2 to 3 modeling lessons from Taraki, and 6 chiseling or sculpting lessons from in John Bacon's studio, as well as some anatomy lessons. And she may have used the Duke of Richmond's collection of antiquities, as he was married to her half-sister. But this was all more kind of private study in a way. And one could easily look at her training and dismiss her as a dilettante, but to do so would be to really kind of ignore the fortitude and persistence of this very ambitious and daring woman who used her position of privilege to circumnavigate a system that was really designed to exclude her and to exclude women. What have we learned, for instance, from Linda Nochlund's seminal 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? It's certainly not because there was a lack of talent, it's because there was a lack of opportunity. And the fine arts world, especially in the 18th century, thrived on gender exclusivity. For instance, one of the fundamental aspects of fine arts training was attending life modeling sessions, at which students would draw or model from living naked models in the flesh. And women were excluded from these classes, just as they were excluded from attaining membership in the Royal Academy. This despite the fact that 2 very powerful women, Mary Moser and Angelica Kauffman, were among the founding members in 1768. Nonetheless, the next woman to become a member of the RA wasn't until 1936. And while Damer exhibited regularly at the Royal Academy, and I don't think that's something we can really underscore or understate enough how exceptional it must have been to see a work of a woman sculptor, at this very public venue of the highest caliber of the Royal Academy. But she did so as Silvia pointed out, an honorary exhibitor. She was never a member. And so as a woman, she was prohibited from attending the committee meetings and the dinners, which were really the main arenas for discussion and sociability among practicing artists.
And when you mentioned the Royal Academy, I mean, I what came into my mind is the fantastic portrait of the Royal Academicians by Zoffany of about 1771, 1772, I think. And you know that the only two founding members and members at all who were women, as you mentioned, Angelica Kaufman and Mary Moser, it's a room with all the academicians and some models posing in the nude and some casts of the antique, again, naked figures. And the two female members are represented via portraits on the wall. Yeah. And, you know, it's just stay there on the wall, but don't quite, not fully.
You know, everything from the studio to the exhibition venue to all of the social dynamics around it, the fine arts world was one that was constructed to be a sphere of male sociability and designed to be exclusive in that manner. Yeah. So these private lessons from Taraki and Bacon were not merely part of a like polite education. They were really her only option, and she was lucky to have them. You know, so from her point of view, she wasn't dabbling. I think, you know, she was really using the tools that were available to her to forge a career for which there was no good model, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I think we can go into a bit more detail about the works of art, starting, I think, from Strawberry Hill again. And Silvia, do you want to tell us a bit, talk us through the works by Anne Damon that we know were in Horace Walpole's collection?
Yes, Walpole probably formed the biggest collection of Anne Damon's sculpture ever. There were 12 sculptures in house, 4 busts, 4 animals, sculpture animals, and 4 medallions, wax medallions. And wax medallion, I think, were the starting point for Anne Damon. She started sculpting with the wax, which was quite usual at the time. And in this slide, we see the famous sleeping dogs, which were displayed at Strawberry Hill in a small room that is called the parlor, that is now the main entry to the house. And what is interesting is that actually most of, actually all of sculpture were mainly displayed in the most private part of the house, in the private rooms where Walpole actually lived. Another interesting observation is that these little dogs in terracotta were displayed together with works of art by other female artists. Walpole was a supporter of other female artists like Diana Burkleck and Agnes Barry, for instance, Mary Barry's sister. And often these works of art were put in dialogue together, which is, I think, an interesting point that deserves more research. These terracotta dogs are quite interesting also because they served as a model for the Duke of Richmond version in marble. And this gives me the opportunity to say that Walpole actually was much more fond of the terracotta version. Why? Because he found that these were actually terracotta sculptured by Anne Damon were actually more lively and dynamic and clever in a sense. More there wasn't this kind of static dimension that marble sculpture sometimes give. And to go on, the second slide is the Osprey. In the library at Strawberry Hill, there was this small sculpture of a fishing eagle that unfortunately is now lost, has been destroyed. And Walpole used to call it the spoiled child of my antique one, that is the marble eagle that we can see on the right, which was at Strawberry Hill and was bought by Walpole in Rome, thanks to Cardinal Albani intervention. What is also interesting to notice about this eagle is that Walpole had it inscribed with this sentence that is non me praxitele finxit at Anne Damon, which means I was sculpted not by Praxitele, but by Anne Damon. So comparing Anne Damon's work with Praxitele. And on another occasion, he also compared her work to Bernini. So this hyperbole that is often quoted and mentioned as a form of exaggeration dictated by affection, in fact, was used by Walpole in order to affirm Andema's talent. Why? Because Walpole was very aware. In a letter, he mentioned the difficulty of the path she had chosen. He knew that there weren't a women sculptor. So his aim was really to affirm a new idea. And the only way to affirm it was to the hyperbole, to the exaggeration. Another interesting point is that the inscription actually was inspired to Walpole by an inscription he had seen in Milano, at the Duomo di Milano, inscribed on this sculpture by Marco da Grate. And the inscription is very similar to the one I just quote. And in fact, I think this was another strategy Walpole was using. I mean, obviously, this San Bartolome by da Grate was very popular at the time because you can see all the anatomical aspect. I mean, it's a very naturalistic sculpture. And again, Walpole wanted, for what concern animal sculpture, to make this point, to clarify, to connect it to these kind of more naturalistic works of art, etc., etc. So again, we see how Walpole was creating an art historical discourse around works of art. Next one is very anecdotal, the Little Kittens. These were given to Walpole by Dema when his beloved dog, Tonton, died. Tonton was a French dog, and Walpole was very fond of this dog. So, and when he died, Walpole was already very old, so he couldn't afford to have another one because eventually it would have been too sad to leave it. So the kittens work, and these were displayed in a small room at Strawberry Hill that is called the Green Closet, that was, in fact, was Walpole's study. So again, and here we see that there are all these stories of domestic pets inside the family. We know that Andema was actually, she wanted the ashes of a dog, Fidel. So there is a connection with. But
she asked for the ashes of a dog and for her chisel and mallet and apron. Exactly. So the two things.
Yes.
Her favorite dog and the instruments of her work.
So this is obviously is more anecdotal, but it's part of the story without any doubt. And then finally, the last thing I would like to show you is the bust of Mary Berry. In my opinion, one of the best work of Andema. And Mary Berry was in fact Andema's best friend, and also Walpole was very fond of Mary Berry. Mary Berry was the one who actually published in 1798 the posthumous collection of works by Horace Walpole. And I think, and was Walpole to introduce Mary Berry to Andema, but then he became very jealous of this relation. So it's funny because there is this kind of triangle, and then Andema certainly gave to Walpole this bust of Mary Berry as an homage, and was the last object by Andema to enter the collection. At the time Andema was living at Strawberry Hill, Andema was living next door because thanks to Walpole, her family could stay at Little Strawberry Hill. And famously, Andema and Berry, they shared a common passion for theater. And actually they performed several pieces at Strawberry Hill. They had an in-purpose theater that was built inside the house. Here we have this very nice drawing that is kept at the Lewis Walpole Library in Farmington, which represent Andema and Berry in the library at Strawberry Hill. And again, there is this very nice set design, which was conceived by Andema and Berry for a comedy written by Berry at Strawberry Hill called Fashionable Friends. And again, we can see in the background is Strawberry Hill. So it's for the museum. This is a very exciting chapter of the history of Strawberry Hill, of course.
And we know actually that Andema took part in these theatricals. She was an actress in some of them, and apparently she was quite she was praised for her acting. But no, thank you, Silvia. And it's good that we sort of close on Mary Berry, because Andema definitely portrayed many of the figures in her sort of close circle of friends. And one of these, not just friends, but her family as well. And so that takes me to the Metropolitan Museum today. And so Elyse, if you'd like to tell us a bit more about the works by Andema in the Met, starting with the portrait bust of her mother.
Absolutely. So this work on the screen is the fabulous portrait bust of Damer's mother, Caroline Campbell, the Countess of Aylesbury and daughter of the fourth Duke of Argyll. The bust is owned by a New York-based collector, Jonathan Kagan, who is a friend of the Department of European Sculpture and Decorative Arts, and has been incredibly generous to keep this work on a kind of long-term loan since 2014. And in Walpole's list of Damer's works, he mentions 3 different versions of this work, 3 different versions of this portrait, 2 versions in terracotta and another version in marble. And I know two versions in stone, and the two terracottas, you know, may be in private hands or somewhere. But Percy Noble then in the early 20th century mentions 2 versions in stone, one in marble, probably this version, and then a version in Portland stone that Damer placed on her mother's tombstone in 1808 at the parish church in Kent, where she herself was eventually buried alongside her mother with the sculpting tools and the bones of her beloved.
The famous ashes.
So really, it wasn't just sculpting tools and the bones. It was also her mother and representation of her mother through her own work. It's like, you know, it's a whole story or kind of tableau about her life in a way. Anyway, the sitter is, you know, here depicted in this truncated bust length format, and is, you know, it's slightly smaller than life size, and she's just gorgeously coiffed and veiled in the guise of a classical matron. And so I've included this image of Faustina just to demonstrate, you know, the degree to which Damer was really looking directly to antiquity for inspiration in the whole kind of character of the figure, but also in the kind of carving style and compositional style. Notice the kind of geometry, the symmetry and geometry of the facial features, the kind of almond eyes, the sort of pattern of her hair, and the deep cutting of the drapery. This, you know, Damer style strongly evokes this type of figure. And Faustina, being a female figure who inspired great respect as an empress, she was really a beloved historical figure. But Campbell's portrait is one of, you know, regal beauty and just serenity, which clearly evokes the ideals of ancient sculpture, and in so doing connects like the virtues of the past with the likeness of a living person. And to portray her mother in this manner was really the highest form of flattery, to create such an ideal portrait. Notably, Damer inscribed the bust in no fewer than 4 places. And this is a theme we'll kind of return to, but I want to point it out now that, you know, the inscription on the front of the socle announces the sitter, and it says Caroline Campbell, daughter of the Duke of Argyll. Yeah. And the work is also signed, not twice, but 3 times in Latin and Greek on the left and right sides, you know, to showcase Damer's erudite connection to the classical tradition. And then on the back is a personal dedication written in a more kind of modest script to her friend and mother. So the bust was clearly very special to Damer, who actually kept it throughout her life, and then it was a bequest on her death. And lastly, I'll just add that this work it's something one has to see in person. So I encourage people to come to the galleries. It's so beautiful, and I'm always struck by how well Damer finds this balance between the kind of sensuality of the marble and the purity of the sitter in this portrait. It's one of those works that has this pristine surface. It feels like a kind of ostrich egg. It has that just wonderful, wonderful surface that is really, really appealing, and which reminds me a lot of the work of Canova and his ideal heads. And so I just wanted to briefly address, because people often ask me, is there a relationship between Damer and Canova? When in fact, this sculpture probably kind of predates his ideal heads. It doesn't predate him, probably, but predates where he really sort of develops the ideal heads as a sort of popular format. But we know that Canova, at least later in her life, was quite supportive of her career, as Silvia pointed out. There are no letters from Damer in the Canova archives to document a correspondence. And of course, most of Damer's personal papers were destroyed after her death, not all of them, but many. But we do know that Mary Berry and Canova had entertained a very close friendship, which began in 1784 and was reignited when Canova visited London in 1815. So Berry writes in her journal that Canova, visited her multiple times, 2 days in a row. And at that point in 1815, Damer and Mary Berry were no longer living together, so Damer may not have been present. But I have a very strong feeling that they met in London while Canova was there. Why? Because Canova's whereabouts during his trip in London are both well documented and not well documented. Who he met is not well documented. Where he went is, and he basically was on, a month-long social party.
Must have had plenty, yeah.
Yeah, and it was diplomacy and socializing, and he went to the Holland House and to the Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square. He went everywhere that Damer regularly inhabited. This was her sphere of this Whiggish circle that Canova was, occupying daily. And so I'm almost certain they met. The one place they didn't meet was at the big Royal Academy dinner hosted by Benjamin West for Canova, at which all the members were present and are kind of listed and named. But of course, she would not have been present at that for the reasons I've already sort of explained. We do have more specific evidence of Canova's support for Damer when a few years later, Mary Berry visits him in Rome and writes to Damer on April 3rd in 2021, or 2021, 1821, that Canova has got me a piece of marble for you. And Silvia mentioned this, which we'll have sent, in the same group with the trifles of my own being sent by sea. And Mary Berry's referring to the sculptures that Canova gave to her, the small terracottas. So moving on, the other work by Damer on display in the Met is this friendly Maltese, a shock dog, which was
wonderful name,
a term for a Maltese because of the kind of rough coat, which probably dates to the early 1780s. Again, the dating on a lot of Damer's is not great. The chronology is not really. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. But this is a most beguiling demonstration of the art of this great animalier sculptor. Britain boasted several such sculptors, notably Damer and Joseph Gott. And we at the Met like to think of this as, the happiest moment in the genre when, this piece just carved with great sort of personality and élan. The work was purchased in 2014, and you'll notice that the credit line, in the credit line, that it was acquired with the help of Barbara Walters, who contributed towards this in honor of her small dog, Cha-Cha. So this is our resident.
Tonton that Walpole had.
Yeah, no,
double names.
Yeah, that when personal sentiments mix with, you know, the seriousness of marble. But this is, you know, this is not a hers was a Havanese dog. This is a Maltese breed, and it's the perfect summation of the breed with that, you know, silken, delightfully meandering white coat of hair, the kind of exacting anatomical precision, but also the psychological sensitivity, you know, the psychology of a dog. This is a portrait that we feel we know instantly. You know, cheerful, loyal, slightly needy, looking up to the master, but very eager to please. You know, it's really characterizes this dog so nicely. So one of the critiques that was launched at Damer was that she was quite limited in her range, right? That we find portraits of her friends and animals, but of course these are subjects that she had access to. But in this portrait of a dog, we do see this kind of really able, deft naturalism that one could see in any genre. And one of the highest compliments paid to Damer then became kind of fodder for criticism, as Silvia said, is the kind of hyperbole of Walpole's description that he was looking at the terracotta model for this, and said, I'll read the quote, "Mrs. Damer has chosen a walk more difficult and far more uncommon than painting. The annals of statuary record few artists of the fair sex, and not one that I recollect of any celebrity. Mrs. Damer's busts from the life are not inferior to the antique. Her shock dog, large as life and only not alive, has a looseness and softness in the curls that seemed impossible to terracotta. It rivals the marble of Bernini in the Royal Academy." And while the comparison to Bernini, you know, is somewhat a distraction, I think, what I find remarkable about this quotation is Walpole's recognition of the significance of Damer's contributions as a woman sculptor. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not true that there were no other women sculptors. And by the late 18th century, women artists were becoming more visible, but it is certainly true that Damer was really the first very public, professional British woman sculptor to be, you know, exhibiting at the Royal Academy, at the, you know, to be exhibiting and making works at the level she was.
Yeah, and I think one brief thing that I was going to say in relation to, we have here the signature, which we're going to go back to, but, you know, these are signed in pride of place. So she wasn't taking these as kind of, you know, little things, just sort of intimate objects, and that's about it. These are the work of a sculptor. And Seymour Damer made this in Greek. But I think before we go back to how, you know, how she saw herself as a sculptor and how she perceived her profession, we've talked with Silvia about Strawberry Hill and how we've heard how her work was displayed there. Can you tell us about so the Met is, you were telling me, the only museum in America to have sculptures by Ann Damer. And you recently, in February 2020, reopened the British galleries with an completely new display. So how does her work, how is it inserted into the narrative of the new British galleries at the Met?
Sure. I mean, first I want to just acknowledge that the new British galleries at the Met are really the brainchild of Luke Sison, the former fearless leader of ESDA, and Eleanor Alcorn, along with Elizabeth St. George. And then in this kind of, you know, change of the guard, there was their vision came to fruition through the dedication of Wolf Burchard and Sarah Lawrence, as well as the ESDA collections and curatorial teams. This was a massive, massive institutional endeavor. And my part in it all was very modest. So I speak to the display only from the point of view of you know, being the sculpture curator. But this, the overarching theme of the galleries is this idea of creativity in an entrepreneurial society. And here in this gallery shot, you're seeing a kind of slice of a corridor of the gallery. And you see the bust and the shock dog on this platform on the right. To the right of them is this incredible console and mirror by Robert Adam. And then through the door just beyond them is Canova's reclining nymph, which is situated in the Lansdowne dining room. And so within the display, we have Damer situated, historically situated very, very nicely, you know, between the Lansdowne dining room, where she would have been many, many times in her life and congregated in that very room. So many times it was both a sculpture gallery and a dining room and a meeting place for wigs. And then, you know, Robert Adam being the kind of very influential architectural designer of that moment. And then if you go to the next slide, she's also situated next to Joseph Nollekens, an artist who Silvia mentioned was very supportive of her. And this grouping I find very interesting because we have Damer next to really the most commercial of all sculptors at this very moment, Nollekens. And this is a portrait of Lawrence Stern by Nollekens that was one of many versions in marble made by his workshop, where assistants were really kind of churning out this really popular composition that was modeled from life in 1766 and then made for over a decade after, because it was a kind of collectible celebrity portrait. Whereas Damer's works were carved by her own hand. And she tried at one point in her career, as we've discussed, to employ these commercial tactics or strategies, but was immediately criticized for having done so. You know, to take up a practice that was really standard across the industry and accepted by somebody like Nollekens was not seen as really acceptable for her. So she sculpted her own works. And in that light, I think it's quite interesting that she's signing her pieces with a dual signature.
Yep.
Something that I would suggest, you know, my interpretation of, in a sense, being that she's signing it twice because she's saying, I modeled this and I sculpted it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is
the two parts of her profession, of her work. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's an assertion of her agency and of her skill as a creator and as a kind of, and as a carver. Yeah. You know, so I find that kind of interesting, and I think this kind of vignette, you look at this within the context of the theme of the gallery being about entrepreneurship, and you have quite an interesting critical framework for thinking about these two works.
Yeah.
You know, if she had ever taken up the kind of, well, the social strictures of that period were that she could never take up the more commercial practices that Nollekens did. Because she would be seen as a kind of vulgar saleswoman of her works, and she wanted to be seen as a very serious artist.
Coming from an aristocratic background.
Yes, and this is not just about gender, but about class. Mm-hmm. And so other recent acquisitions in the British galleries that, you know, touch on similar themes and just demonstrate the presence of and contributions of women would include this recent acquisition, a portrait of Mary Shelley by Camilla Pistrucci. And this was carved in Rome in the year of Shelley's Italian sojourn. And it's a classicizing portrait, clearly, that presents her as a kind of virtuous lady of letters dressed in a manner that evokes the ancient busts of Roman empresses. And in the 18th and 19th century, and Britain, you know, really gifted men renowned for their contributions to the humanities or the arts were frequently depicted in classicizing portraits with, you know, kind of big, broad shoulders and this kind of imposing format. Line the walls of libraries to create this environment of erudition. And what I love about this portrait is that, you know, he's depicting Shelley in this conventional portrait type that was typically reserved for the likenesses of men. thereby inserting her into this kind of pantheon of England's, remarkable minds. And this bust comes at the very end of our 19th century galleries, but I included it in this presentation because I find there to be, interesting questions to think about in regards to sort of self-fashioning. How did Mary Shelley present herself as, versus how did Damer present herself, and what kinds of, similar or different challenges did they face? I mean, Mary Shelley came from quite a radical background. She was the daughter of William Godwin, the radical philosopher, and the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. But here she presents herself in the very kind of demure presentation of a kind of Victorian woman. Damer, on the other hand, comes from aristocratic background, but if we are to believe some of the accounts of how she presented herself as a kind of blue stocking woman, and in different ways, she clearly crafted a different kind of persona for herself. Again, it's hard to say how much of that was kind of sexist criticism, or how much of that she may have embodied by wearing, men's clothing or caps or things like that.
It's always, we have the accounts of others. We hardly ever have her own voice. So apart from in her work, but and there's another female.
Can I just only say something? And also between Andema and Mary Shelley, obviously the 19th century, the early 19th century, it's a different historic period as well. I think. I mean, from a social cultural point of view, I mean, there is a distance, and there is also a self-consciousness that is somehow a little bit different.
It's a generation later.
Absolutely.
I agree. Yeah.
And
so, another example that's more contemporary would be Eleanor Code. I mean, this is a piece that dates to about 1780. And she was this pioneering entrepreneur who began this manufactory in Lambeth in 1769, which made these durable, weatherproof artificial stone called Code stone.
Of her invention.
Of her own.
It's important of her own invention to point out.
And she offered over, 750 designs that were not all made by her. But when she started out in the 1770s, she would exhibit at the Society of Artists and include her name as Sculptor. Mrs. Eleanor Code, Sculptor, is how things were autographed. And it wasn't until later in the 1780s that she started to give these same designs to other artists who worked for her, such as John Bacon and Thomas Banks. And at that point, she assumed and really embraced the role of the kind of business woman, and a kind of the owner of this brand. And the entrepreneur of this brand, as opposed to the sculptor or maker. And so, but she comes from a very different background, right, than Damer. The same moment, but entirely different sort of life stories, where she comes from a kind of a family that were wool merchants. So she already inhabited this world of kind of capitalism and trade.
More entrepreneurial, yeah.
Yes. Whereas Damer occupied this kind of rarefied world, where this idea of kind of selling and being part of business was really more anathema to a woman of her stature, right?
I think it's also worth mentioning that possibly because she asked for all her papers to be destroyed after she died, possibly because there were no records, but we do not have any account books for Andema Studio. We don't have any records of payments she received, even for the public commissions. So it's definitely a different way of being a sculptor to Eleanor Code. But I think it's very important to underline how they were effectively near contemporaries, I think it's wonderful that in the Met, in the British Galleries, you can get a sense of what was happening at the time. I think we're running out of time a bit, but I wanted to briefly sort of go back to the signatures and ask you both, here I've put the slides again with the kittens as well, and the terracotta of Mary Berry, which is signed at the back. Unfortunately, we don't have a slide of that, but it's signed in Latin. And Dame of London made this. And so that, the signatures, and in general, I think what I'd like to ask you both is, we have an artist who signs her work again and again, and is obviously very proud of it. And as I was saying earlier, she decides to open a studio when she's finishing the big King George III for people to see her at work. But at the same time, some of her contemporaries and critics afterwards always called her, an amateur, a dilettante. Where, is it important to make this distinction, and why? And, maybe Silvia, do you want to start on this, and do you want to tell us? And then Elyse, what are your thoughts? And does it make sense to make this distinction for us today on Dame's work?
I think that historically, the distinction existed. And also, if I remember well, Walpole was quite, in a couple of occasions, is insisted on the fact that for an amateur sculptress was important not to receive money. So I think also there was a kind of projection on these. And I think historically the distinction existed. So I think for an art historian, it is important to take into account this distinction. And after all, I think, yes, technically speaking, Dema was an amateur in the sense that she didn't earn money out of a job. And maybe, as you mentioned before, the fact that we don't have information about apprenticeship, no medals, no modellos, no drawings after the antique, obviously had an influence on our, more recent opinions and critical assessment on her. But without it remains that as art historians, I think we need to actually to give her the position she deserves by evaluating what the outcome of her activity, the factual art of works of art, and also to and that's it. And obviously for contemporary standards, this distinction is less important. But, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Silvia. No, did you want to finish?
No, but obviously she was more than an amateur. It's without any doubt.
Yeah, I agree with Silvia in that this distinction existed clearly, and we shouldn't deny that it did. I do wonder, however, kind of moving forward as art history continues to be written and taught, whether we continue to dwell on those categories, knowing kind of being in a different place where we are now, and might we start instead to move to a place where we critically examine what those structures were, what did the professional world, what did that mean, to be a professional sculptor versus an amateur, and how was that world intentionally structured and constructed to exclude women altogether, and if we can sort of examine it from a more kind of critical point of view, then we can also acknowledge, the incredible obstacles that Damer kind of overcame to just create and display works altogether, and the ways in which, as I mentioned at the beginning, she tried to sort of penetrate and circumnavigate and get around these structures just in order to produce things for the public.
And can I add something? Also, I think it's important always to
just stop the screen share, just because I'll look at the Q&A and maybe,
okay.
But do go on. I'll just stop.
No, well, just also to remember that Andema, not only she was a woman, a sculptress when obviously the field was dominated by men, but also she belonged to the first generation of British sculptors. Until the previous generation of sculptors were all foreigners. And so, there was also an element of novelty, which is even, which makes us also think about how difficult for her was to to actually show her work in a nation that didn't have any tradition yet. So
absolutely. And I think we have, I've just looked at the questions in the Q&A. Very briefly, who were the other female artists in Horace Walpole's collection? I think we've approached that with Silvia earlier. We mentioned Diana Beauclerk. And I think there is a possibility that we will explore this theme further with London Art Week. So I'll leave that as a promise for the future. Were the works of Dama, has the works of Dama been on display for some time at the Met or just recently? Elyse, you said the bust of Lady Campbell is on loan since 2014.
Yeah, so basically both works as a loan and as an acquisition came in 2014, and they were on display until the British galleries were refurbished, so they went off display and now they're back on.
Okay.
They're not new since this display. They existed.
And lastly, I think we can go back to there's a question about the signature. Did she invariably sign her works in Latin or Greek? And can you comment on why she chose to do so? And I think we mentioned briefly how obviously signing, first of all, is an act of taking possession of your creation, both of your creation and of your physical process of creating it, not just the mental, but also why Latin or Greek, if you'd like to add something about it and how she, you know, what did it say about her, how she positioned herself towards ancient art?
For a sculptor who lacked some of the formal training, her decision to sign things in Latin and Greek, which was a demonstration of her kind of erudition, to me is sort of positioning herself in a very specific space of kind of refined artist. You know, most sculptors didn't have aristocratic backgrounds. Most sculptors were not as educated as Anne Damer was. Actually, you know,
yeah.
We look at a lot of sculptors, they come from, you know, artisan families. So this idea that you're a sculptor and also kind of fluent in different languages, I know she wasn't fluent in Greek, but, and sort of demonstrate.
She comments several times that, you know, she's still struggling with her ancient Greek, but she really wants to learn it properly. She's not. So
I think it was a very specific kind of response to an angling, a self-positioning, anticipating these critiques of her merits, you know, to sort of sign things in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, I think maybe also the importance of Greek, I mean, obviously needs to be reconnected to a relation to like William Hamilton and Winkelmann. I mean, it's part of these.
And I think it's worth also mentioning that at the time, we now distinguish very much between ancient Greek and ancient Roman art. The same distinction in terms of quality and style was only just beginning, I mean,
then
just beginning to be made then. So her signing, for example, in Greek, I think is very significant because ancient art was seen as Greek art. It was the art of the Greeks that was the example for sculptors at the time. So I think it's very significant that she chooses. I have one last question about Code. What evidence is there that she ever sculpted herself, Eleanor Code? And nor did she invent the formulation. She took on a working manufactory in 1769, but there is a long history of other procedures. And certainly she signed because she was concerned about casts being taken from her work. I mean, that would certainly have been an issue with any sculptor, especially on a sort of more, from a more commercial point of view. You could take casts and repeat the work of another artist. But if you, maybe Elyse, if you want to say anything about, was there any evidence that she ever sculpted herself?
No, I mean, not that I know, but I don't, I would have to do more research. I can't answer definitively, but I don't know of any evidence that she did sculpt herself. My point was that she signed that way. very intentionally or deliberately. And I agree that that's probably part of her strategy, was simply sort of branding and possession. But that she then moves away from that and kind of embraces the role of entrepreneur. And yeah, there were many recipes for different types of artificial stone. And hers was, you know, her own secret sauce that she created in collaboration with others. But she was not alone in that. Yeah.
No, she was not. I mean, we as a gallery came across another similar, also, I can't remember if it was also a woman, but from France. So it was definitely not a singularly British experience, but I think it's important to point out how her manufacture was quite unique at the time. I think maybe unless you want to add anything, I think we can conclude on that note. And I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and thank our speakers, Silvia and Elyse. I think it's been really wonderful to talk about Andema and to rediscover so many aspects of her work. And again, as Elyse was saying, I very much encourage anybody who can to go to the Met and see her work in the New British Galleries, and also visit Strawberry Hill, where so much of her work actually started. So thank you very much, and do follow our program of talks at London Art Week, and see you next time.